Hello, welcome to Jessi's Craft Corner. I'm still trying to play catch up with all of my recorded footage, so let's go ahead and get started. Lacking any other options at the time, I decided to try carving the helmet with foam. This is just 1-inch insulation sheets, which you can find at most home improvement stores. I glued 2 pieces together to make a cube and traced an outline of the helmet shape so I would have some guidelines for chopping off the excess. I didn't do a very good job, which is why I had problems later. What I should have done is carve out the side profile first and then the front. So don't pay any attention to the girl in the video, she's doing it all wrong. Because my technique was so bad, I had to keep retracing the outlines, which ended up warping the final shape. And I stupidly started rounding before I had it trimmed down to the correct size, which caused me to have to do a whole bunch of extra carving. You can see how the helmet shape is just a bit off. I spent a lot of time trying to correct this, but I never actually succeeded. I'm shaving off some small bits to try and correct this, and refining the shape with sandpaper. Sanding is tedious, so I'm just going to skip through this part. Still not happy, I went back to trimming off bits. And more sanding. Ugh. I went ahead and traced the key elements for more detailed carving, referencing my templates for placement. Okay, this front center is way off, which at this scale shows up a lot. You'll see that I fixed it before carving the cheeks. Turns out, the easiest way to carve the cheek sections is to cut along the bottom edge and then trim the upper section to match. As for how I did the detail, I don't know. I carved this back in August and forgot to film it, so we're just going to say that I used unicorn magic or something. I guess I thought recording the key slot was more interesting, even though it's just a square. Enjoy this riveting footage. Oh, or not, I guess we're done with that. We'll just skip ahead to sealing with the Mod Podge. I was unhappy with how this turned out, but instead of carving it again, I put it away for 4 months and worked on a bunch of other stuff. To be honest, I do believe that this technique would work. I'm just not as good at carving as I would like, so I didn't bother trying to do it that way a second time. So here's the first one. Not bad, but And then my husband spotted this in the checkout. And guess what? It's to scale! I decided to glue the halves together before removing it from the base because it was easier to line them up and hold them in place. And then it was time to break out the hacksaw. This is when I was joined by my boss, who supervised the rest of the project. You can see she didn't like the first helmet attempt either. Back to sawing. This was actually pretty easy to cut through. Went a lot faster than I thought it would. Trimmed out the bottom of the helmet, and oh man. It literally just occurred to me that I could have skipped this step and just filled up the helmet with foam and used it to replace the head. I think I'll do that next time. And Snips is back for more smooching. On to the tedious process of sanding, trimming, sanding, 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 trimming, more sanding, cleaning. Skip! Oh look, it's done. Then I had to remove all of the details that make it Jinjarin's helmet. I kept an eye on the thickness while I filed to make sure that I didn't put a hole in it. The easiest way to check was to hold it up to the light and see how much was shining through. Ah, baby smooth. I cut out the key slot detail to move it to the correct position for Boba's helmet. Using a thin plastic for sale sign, I cut out a panel to cover the back of the helmet and super glued it in place. I deliberately cut the key slot hole smaller than I needed it to be so that I could neatly trim it to the correct size. Skittles decided to poke her nose in. And then Snips got jealous. After making sure everything was glued tight, I drew the line for the new helmet bottom and trimmed it down. And back to filing. There is a lot of this on this project. The next detail to take care of was removing the ear caps. The caps in the Mandalorian are a different style than the classic Boba helmet. Fortunately, the plastic in this area is super thick, so sanding it down wasn't a problem. I'm measuring out the cover panels for the front of the helmet in the laziest way possible, by eye. Popped out to the garage to quickly heat shape the plate a little before gluing it in place. And I rolled it on the table to make sure I got a good bond. Rough cut out of the cheek shape before I slowly trimmed out the cheek area. Even being as careful as I was, I made a couple of whoops that I had to glue back in place, but it looks good in the end. The reason I'm covering the faceplate is because of these little cutouts on the bottom of the visor. I'd show you more of the trimming, but I couldn't stay in frame. Guess what? More sanding! Also, I apparently forgot to record the back detailing. Oh well. The strips on the inside of the helmet is pieces of aluminum tape to reinforce the seams. So, ear caps. I worked on both at the same time as one long piece because the pieces were so small by themselves and I needed something to hold on to. More sanding, crisping up the details with a razor. Here's a close-up on some details. Then back to sanding. At this point, I had to stop for some cat cuddles, because, let's be honest, how could you say no to this face? Also, she rolled in my dust pile and I had to clean her. Back to work. I trimmed off the bottom angle on the left ear because I didn't think it was crisp enough. And I replaced it. It'll be sanded into shape later. The bottom half of the right ear cap. It's one of those tiny pieces that is very detailed and annoying shape. On to the rangefinder base. To be honest, I wasn't originally planning on making this a moving piece, but at this point I figured I had put so much time into this project, so why not? If I had any aluminum sheet metal that was the right thickness, I would have used it for the stock, but I didn't, so I used plastic. And boy, let me tell you, when you are making moving parts at this scale, you have to be precise. It's like the equivalent of watchmaking or something. It took a lot of tiny adjustments to get the movement to be smooth, and have it all sit at the correct angle on both the up and down positions. That said, I'm happy I took the time to make this a moving piece, partially because it's cool, but also as a safety precaution. On full-size helmets, the rangefinder stocks are prone to breaking. At this size, it means that if it gets bumped, it's more likely to move instead of snapping off. You can see how often I'm checking the size of the stock while cutting. As a side story, my dad used to build battleship models out of wood, and my earliest memory of scratch building was making a miniature X-Wing fighter out of toothpicks and popsicle sticks with my dad when I was 5 or 6 years old. I still have it sitting on my shelf to this day. Time to drill a tiny hole in the stock. I mean, you can't really see what I'm doing, but I told you, so you know. Let's check and see how it fits. Tweak the top a bit. And attach the caps, including this tiny, stupid wedge detail. And checking the fit again. And drilling a small hole in the cap to run the pen through. Stupid tiny piece. This part was hard. I had to line up the cap, mark where the antenna sat so I could drill a corresponding hole in the helmet base. And guess what? I still got it wrong and had to fiddle around with it for an hour to make it work properly. Stupid tiny parts. And now for the rangefinder itself. Fun fact, this is the most difficult part of Boba's helmet to draw in artwork. Mostly because it's a complex shape and not a rectangle, so 95% of the time, no matter how hard you try, the angle looks freaking wonky. That said, aside from the tiny size, it's actually a pretty easy piece to make, thanks to the fact that it's entirely made out of flat angles with no weird raised sections. Looking at you, ear caps. I was also fortunate enough to have a full-size one that I could use for reference. Thank you, James. The top cap of the rangefinder needed to be slightly larger than the base, so I decided to leave this on the stick to give me something to hold on to while I worked. And now for the tiny window. Honestly, I did this wrong. I should have cut the tiny square out from the inside and then cut the frame around it and then glued it in place. It would have been way easier than what I did, but I did eventually get it shaped the way I wanted it to be. Mostly. Enough that I'm happy with it. And it's finally time to attach it to the stock. I decided the easiest way would be to drill a hole in the bottom and then trim it to the right size for a sturdy connection. It just occurred to me that it's kind of insane that I put this much detail into something that is half the size of my pinky nail. I didn't really think about it while I was working on it, but while I'm watching the footage, like, how tiny that is just kind of hit me. A quick measure for distance before trimming the stock and finishing the last side of the rangefinder. And now for the last part, pinning the rangefinder to the helmet. I didn't have a really good angle to film this at, so let's just skip to the part where it's attached already. And here's how the helmet turned out. This video is long enough for now, so I'll be painting it in a later episode. That's all for now. I hope you enjoyed this build. As always, thanks so much for watching and have a great rest of your day.